and neutral party that both adjudicates and mediates in complex conflicts around the globe. The three current flashpoints, namely the Middle East, Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and Taiwan, have undoubtedly accentuated the UNHRC's current impotence due to the ever-growing divisions among nations and the increasing gulf between the global north and the global south. Never was there a time when the UNHRC seemed so vulnerable and wanting, and its credibility at stake. And never has there been a more urgent time when the UNHRC needed to properly look at itself and reassess its role in the UN organization and beyond. Here we wish to briefly recount the path to this complex situation and outline our view of what the UNHRC should consider in its reassessment, particularly concerning Sri Lanka. Indeed, given the current situation in the world, now is precisely the time for the UNHRC to abandon its failed conflict resolution models and instead consider alternatives that promise speed and success. Sri Lanka suffered for almost 3 decades from a bloody terrorist campaign by one of the most brutal groups to call itself a liberation movement. Indeed, the state and the people across the island suffered massively from the conflict. Indeed, the state and the people across the island, the war ended in 2009 with the comprehensive defeat of the LTTE, and yet the ending of the war did not bring complete relief to the people of Sri Lanka. Of course, terrorism receded from sight and sound, but it has lingered in the minds of the people right until now. The reason is apparent. The conflict from the very outset was internationalized by the supporters of the LTTE and some of the leading Western nations whose duplicity in the conflict has led to the present morass. Hence, now is the time for the UNHRC to abandon its position regarding the ethnic problem in Sri Lanka and look at alternatives from the perspective of Sri Lanka and its stakeholders from all the communities sharing the island. NATO in the East, a ghost from the colonial past. The recent call from the Defense Department of the Confederation of Switzerland for closer cooperation with the NATO alliance beyond what already exists, which clearly signals the likelihood of joining the alliance, has caused consternation and confusion, not only among the ardent domestic supporters of this unique nation's deeply entrenched policy of unconditional neutrality, but it will cause deep disappointment to numerous small nations and the generally vulnerable states alike that view Switzerland as the standard bearer for freedom and peace in the world. The gulf between the North and the South is widening. The inherent military threat posed by NATO, which is the military alliance embracing most European states and North America, and its antipodian allies, Australia and New Zealand, is a fundamental cause of concern for many nations in the global South. They certainly have to contemplate the consequences of living under duress in a world dominated by a military giant with a might comparable to the combined power and influence of the imperial powers of the 19th and 20th centuries, and which is now contesting the power and influence of the rising Asian giants, China and India. 2 centuries ago, Britain and its imperial rivals managed, often brutally, to subjugate most parts of the world, including all the old, fabled civilizations in every region of the globe. The subjugation of China and India was the greatest of pursuits and challenges, resulting in the ultimate crisis for the Western powers in the era of imperial expansion. In a repetition of history, the global North's military arm is becoming increasingly engaged in the Indo-Pacific region, directly challenging China and indirectly hinting at India that the West wants to remain, for the foreseeable future, the overlord in the world order created after World War II in the middle of last century. Undoubtedly, the parallels will come across to most critics as trivial. Still, in the current context of heightened tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, they are an accurate indication of the increasing bitter rivalry between the global north and the regional nuclear powers who question the hegemonic presence of the Western alliance in their neighborhood, threatening their independence and the mostly peaceful, if at times uneasy, coexistence among the Asian neighbors. Revisiting the scene of imperial conquest with NATO is undoubtedly a show of power, the throwing down of the gauntlet by the global north in utter disregard of the feelings and psyche of the nations in the region. In any case, is the presence of NATO in the Far East a blatant provocation to entangle China and perhaps Russia in a deadly confrontation? Emerging Asian superpowers. In the era of European imperial expansion, both China and India had become tame giants who could not match up to the military and technological might of the Western colonial powers. 2 centuries later, the Western alliance will certainly not find the two Asian giants tame and willing to be controlled and manipulated as if by the ghosts of their past. These two increasingly self-confident and technologically savvy nations have long since discarded their timidity and the sense of inferiority towards the Western powers. Hence, the presence of NATO in Asia could very well lead to a disastrous confrontation in the Indo-Pacific region with wholly unexpected consequences. Roots of a thorny problem. However, the roots of the UNHRC's problems do not lie in the present or in the near past. Instead, we believe they go a long way back as the UN evolved over time to address a fast-changing world. The landmark Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted in the aftermath of the Second World War, and its horrors and the victorious nations and their draftmen imbued it with the spirit of Western liberal thinking and values. In the following decades, as imperial powers shed their colonial possessions, mostly under compulsion, and quickly established themselves as the champions of Western democracy and the guardians of universal human rights, they did so to take the moral high ground, as they say, before the rest of the world, and simultaneously eradicate the ugly stains of the vicious and often inhumane colonial rule which, after centuries of cruelty and maltreatment of Jewish people in every part of Europe, culminating in Hitler's Holocaust. In this narrative, Imperial Britain played the most significant and infamous role in creating intractable problems as it withdrew from its far-flung empire. From the partitioning of India to the redrawing of the map in the Middle East, the creation of Israel and the displacement of the Palestinians, Britain showed little or no regard to the possible consequences of its actions and to the rights of the people in those lands and their future. Britain's critical errors in Africa, Asia, Australia, the Americas, the Indian Ocean Islands, and the Pacific Islands have lasting consequences, with many resulting in wide-scale loss of lives and livelihoods and displacement of the people, and most of all, continuing armed conflicts. Today, Britain prides itself on its multilingual society and its cultural diversity. With a prime minister of Indian origin, the first minister of Scotland of Pakistani origin, and a newly designated first minister of Wales of African heritage, Britain seems to believe that it has now a clean West and the ignominious colonial past is mostly forgotten. In reality, Britain has not totally come to terms with its imperial transgressions and instead it continues to believe that it has an undying moral authority over the whole world. The presence of large communities of migrants from former colonies in many cities in Britain is seen as a symbol of the exoneration of its colonial past and the justification and the necessity for interfering in the internal affairs of those former colonies. Perspectives and interpretations. That's the final subtext. Drawing on a well-known analogy, it all seemed like the people who broke the door down, crashed the furniture, beat up the occupants, or even killed some, and then burned the house down, would come back and demand the survivors to build their home again, but only according to the wishes of the perpetrators of the crime. The new world order was built in the image of transgressors, turned into visionaries, who made unavoidable demands and placed unreasonable strictures on the newly independent nations across the globe. The West's view of democracy as the ultimate guarantor of universal human rights is predicated on the uncritical acceptance of Western values and standards that have ironically shifted and changed over time and on expediency. Western democracy also demands compliance with international financial and trading systems controlled by the United States and ably supported by its Western allies. Furthermore, adherence to Western democracy implicitly requires unconditional acceptance of the world order controlled by the United States with the ardent support of the members of the Western alliance. In this world order, the free world is protected and the rest of the world is kept in line through the menacing presence of the ubiquitous US Navy in all seas and oceans and the unknown number of military bases dotted across the globe, ready to suppress dissent and undermine overturned regimes unfriendly to the US or the Western alliance. However, rising powers such as China and India are emerging as possible challenges to the US hegemony, and it is highly likely that the world is already shifting from a unipolar to a multipolar world. In our view, this is the background to the present problems facing the UNHRC and the complexities in the conduct of the Council. The conflicting interests of the Western Alliance and the rest of the world have recently heightened significantly and are becoming increasingly transparent, while regional conflicts have deepened or increased in number with the emergence of superpower and bloc rivalry. In the current shifting political landscape, policies and conduct of the Western nations vis-a-vis the global South are proving to be questionable, and the West, claim to the moral high ground, has become a farce. Indeed, the West is guilty of double standards when dealing with the perceived friends and foes. A different approach. Clearly, Sri Lanka is a case in point for the UNHRC to reassess its policies and conduct and start